Uhuru, brothers and sisters and comrades. This is Amali Shatel. I'm chairman of the African People's Socialist Party. I'm leader of the Uhuru movement and the International African Revolution. I want to thank you for joining on today, and I'm hoping that a lot of people will be joining us because we have to be our own media, as you understand. We're not going to be able to get the kind of coverage for this discussion that it deserves, not coming from the colonial media, not coming from the colonizers' media. So I want to thank you for coming on to this discussion. What I want to talk to you about are two issues. One has to do with the fact of the Democratic Party National Convention that just concluded a couple of days ago, and the Republican Party National Convention that is occurring right now. This is really important because there are a lot of people who experience an assumption of success or failure, hope or lack of hope based on what happens in these conventions held by the two political parties. And I hear even people who are considered leftist leaders, if you will. I say so-called leftists because I'm not quite sure I understand exactly what that means. And sometimes nationalists and sometimes communists or pseudo-communists and socialists. They pin most of their hopes on the outcome of these elections. And they make most of their analyses based on the performance of the particular political parties, one of the two major colonial political parties, or the persons who represent those parties in a contest such as what is occurring right now. The two political parties, the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, they use the convention to, among other things, formalize the persons who will be running for president and vice president of the United States. The Democrats have already done that. They formalized Joe Biden, the former vice president under Barack Hussein Obama, the former senator from Delaware, and as his vice president, Kamala Harris, the person who was a district attorney, chief prosecutor for the state of California, et cetera. The Republicans will formalize the candidacy of Donald Trump, the current president, and his vice president, Pence, will be formalized as the forces who will be running against each other. That is to say, the Republican and Democratic parties contending with each other formally and officially through the candidacies of Trump and Biden, Harris, and Pence. So that's the setup. And what, of course, is presented to the world and to people in this country, to the extent that they're capable of so doing, is that these conventions are paragons of a democratic process. They are instances where the people are allowed to come out and exercise their political will, their democratic will, to express their will, to exercise their will. That is how these conventions are put forward to the people and people around the world. And they would give the impression that they actually represent the interests of the people. And so many people, it is true, have staked their future, their hopes, their aspirations on the outcome of these conventions, and then of course on the outcome of the contest between the representatives of the Democratic and Republican parties. So what I want to say is that this is fraudulent. The entire setup is fraudulent, and that we should understand this. We should understand, first of all, how masses of people who do not have the benefit of the kind of political education that we would think that so-called leaders would have, do not have the benefit necessarily of the science of investigating and analyzing society, we can understand how masses of people could be deluded and pushed into the direction of the assumptions of the significance of these conventions and the outcome of the election between Trump and Biden. But increasingly, even that is not the case. But what is problematic is that we have situations where people who pose as leaders, sometimes even as revolutionary leaders, they call themselves leftists, they call themselves communists and nationalists and what have you, how they too function and promote an assumption that somehow by reading the tea leaves of the Democratic and Republican convention, that we get a sense of which direction the country is going in and that our futures should somehow be tied to that. I've seen leftists who proclaim mightily how the Democratic Party, the convention showed that the Democrats have betrayed the interests of the people and especially of African people. And I think that that might be good propaganda in the sense that if it's the objective is to win people away from the social system and reliance on the Democratic Party, it is true that some 25% of the base of the Democratic Party are African people. Most of the political work, the political activity that we engage in normally occurs within the Democratic Party. So it is obviously something that is of a concern for us. But I think that the problem that we have is that most of these leaders, none of these leaders help expose to the people the role and nature of the political party and the conventions themselves that help the people to recognize that there is no future either in the Democratic Party or in the Republican Party, that there is no future in the existing social system for African people, that this is a social system that was founded on genocide of the indigenous people, the traditional custodians of this land, the theft of their land, and on the theft of human beings like ourselves, and the forced labor of African people who created the entire social system that rests upon our backs. This is something that none of them talk about. And then beyond that, it's really important that they do not expose the actual nature of the political elections, of the electoral process inside this country, and in most of what they characterize as bourgeois democratic spaces. Because what must be understood is that the elections themselves are really contests between different sectors of the ruling class. So you have one ruling class that's in charge of everything, and you have two parties that reflect the interests of the ruling class. So it doesn't really matter ultimately who wins the election because the ruling class always win. If a Republican wins, it's the ruling class. If the Democratic Party wins, it's the ruling class. And both the Republican and Democratic Party ruling class has as an objective to maintain the status quo. That is to say, to maintain the relationship of power that exists between the rulers and peoples inside this country and the masses of us, and especially of African people. Because as much as people say they detest the policies of Donald Trump, you hear and the Republican Party that he represents, you do not hear any of them, none of them, no matter how left they seem to be, disagreeing with the Trump administration of the Republican Party's ongoing attack on the country of Iran. You have no condemnation of that. You have no condemnation of the Republican Party or the US government under the auspices of the Republican Party of Donald Trump. You have no condemnation of what they are doing to the people of Venezuela, how they intend to dominate and control the people of Venezuela. You hear no condemnation of an apparatus of oppression that sometimes is called the police department, but there are various manifestations of it. In fact, what you hear from the so-called left wing is that Trump is doing something to besmirch the reputation of sectors of this coercion, apparatus of coercion, that he's besmirching the reputation of the FBI and the CIA and all these other institutions who are trying to protect us from Russians stealing elections and things to that effect. It's the same party, it's the same class that is dominating everything all the time. And what we have with the elections is an opportunity for these contending classes, these contending sectors of the same class to fight among themselves nonviolently. This is a fight among sectors of the ruling class. That's why other questions do not even get on the table. This is the ruling class fighting among itself for control of the state, for control of this organ of oppression and coercion that gives them power that they can exercise with drones, that they can exercise with FBI and police and secret police and things like that, that dominates not only Africans and other people here, but the peoples around the world. This is the contest. And so they don't have to shoot each other. They don't pick up AK-47s and run out against each other. And they don't want to just dominate the world or dominate this state apparatus. That's what it's called, this organization of coercion that includes the prisons, the police, the courts, etc. They're not interested in this for some kind of abstract reason. It's to their benefit economically to do this. It means that they can determine whether petroleum, how petroleum is going to be on the stock market. It means that they can determine which sector of the bourgeoisie is going to be able to be influential when it comes to taking the resources from Congo and other places like that. And inside this country, what kind of laws are going to be passed that can govern the behavior of working people and certainly of African people. This is what they're fighting about. It's not some abstract question of democracy or some abstract question. It is for power to be able to shape and mold the people's lives here in this country and around the world. So this is what this contest is about. And you don't have an instance where there are two different organizations, or you have two different manifestations of organization that represent the same class. That's why this whole notion of what we need is a third party is so hollow and shallow. Because you take a place like Israel, had scores of parties, and Italy, different countries, a whole host of parties. The question is not we need another party. The fact is that we need a revolution, and that these parties, the Democrat and the Republican, represent a social class, a class that is determined to keep the world just as it is, that the people and the interests of the people locked in the death grip of a social system that came into existence through slavery and colonialism. That's what we're looking at. So you can have 14 parties that may have some kind of differences in policies and things like that, but unite with the ongoing existence of imperial domination of the peoples of the world. So the question is not how many parties you got. The question is whether or not you're able to organize to destroy a relationship with the social system that we are dealing with. So this election, this thing that's happening, the thing that they're trying to ramp up all kind of excitement among the people about in terms of the so-called Republican and Democratic conventions, is farcical almost. It is for preserving the relationship that the ruling class has with the vast majority of us, and that is a relationship of oppression and exploitation. There's nothing on the agenda of either party to end the oppression and exploitation of the peoples in this country and around the world. In fact, there are agendas to promote and the oppression and exploitation of the peoples in this country and around the world. So we see this activity with these two conventions. But the most dynamic sector of the population in this country at this time They're not at conventions of the Republicans and Democrats. They're at conventions in Kenosha. These are real people's conventions. They didn't have to get delegates. They didn't ask if you're registered to vote in order to participate in this uprising. And those that are happening in other places subsequent to Kenosha, subsequent to the murder of the shooting, the blatant shooting of Jacob Blake, the murder of people like George Floyd, the murder of people like Mike Brown. It's an incessant, ongoing aggression against the people, and especially colonized people, and especially African people in this country. So they didn't register to vote. They didn't have to go through a credentials committee or anything like that to get any kind of agenda on the table. They didn't have to get the approval of Biden or Trump or anybody else to do anything. In fact, it's precisely because they didn't go. If they had gone before Biden, if they had gone through the Democratic Party, its so-called left wing or any sector of it, they wouldn't be out in Kenosha today. They wouldn't have been in the streets today. And the government wouldn't have had to even pretend that it was responding to the conditions of African and oppressed people in this country. So that's where the real convention is happening. It's among the people. And that's what responsibility that we have as revolutionaries, to promote among the people the reality that revolution is the only solution that we got. And this is not some statement as those charlatans and opportunists are likely to want to interpret it to mean that you don't do anything with the Republicans or the Democrats, you just don't do anything at all. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that African people in this country and most of the world, African people in Kenya, African people in most of the world participated more fully in political life when we were fighting against the system that said you can vote. In fact, in many ways, the vote took away the resistance of the masses of people, and it steered the resistance from the interests of ourselves and into the interests of the ruling class. Because during an election, you can only vote for one sector of the ruling class or the other. You don't have your own program to vote for. Before the so-called right for African people to vote, the 1965 voting rights legislation, African people engaged in serious struggle, and we saw real heroic struggles being made by Fannie Lou Hamer, by Ella Baker, by other people who fought against this social system, who fought and risked their lives to do it. And they fought, when they fought the Democratic Party, they fought the Republican Party, and they fought all these other organizations that were standing in the way of our freedom. And this government had to kill off that revolution and steer everybody into the safe embrace of the Democratic Party, in particular in the African community, in order to quiet the struggle of the masses of the people. We see spontaneous struggle happening all over this country. We've seen, especially since George Floyd, thousands of people, millions of people thrust into political life. People never engaged in demonstrations at all in their history were now engaged in struggle, spontaneous struggle. And of course, the weakness of all of that has been its spontaneity. It was powerful and continues to be powerful. We believe that the people should engage in struggle in every instance it's possible to engage in struggle. We believe in that. But the problem that we have is that the struggle must be able to project a what end, to what end? What are we fighting for? Not just because we are angry, not just because of the latest victim, because the latest victim is just that, the latest one. Up to now, tomorrow, and the day after, there are going to be more and more of them, not only in this country, but the system attacks Africans and oppressed people around the world. So therefore, we must be able to identify the fundamental contradiction that leads to them killing us. You can't get enough body cameras. You can't get enough of these so-called committees where you can investigate what the police did after they killed somebody. That's not satisfactory. The system kills us normally. We are struggling against colonialism. Colonialism is a system that requires incessant, unremitting violence in order for it to be successful. It cannot succeed without violence, because nobody is going to willingly turn their future over to a social system and to also alien and foreigners. When I say foreign and aliens, I'm talking about African people were brought into captivity on the continent of Africa, captured us, brought us here, and we live under captivity inside this country in most places around the world. And sometimes you see the foreigners and sometimes you don't see the foreigners and aliens who control us, and that's called indirect rule. That's called white power in blackface. That's what neo-colonialism is. So our struggle has to be one, to overturn the system itself. And when we look at, again, the Republican and the Democratic Party, we are simply looking at two parties operating for one class. It's one class with two faces that is out there exercising and fighting for its own interests. And that's all it's fighting for. It's not fighting for you. It's fighting in its own interest. And the only time it appears to be fighting for you is when you put enough pressure on the system and it becomes necessary for them to give you a pittance in order to take you off the streets, in order to keep you loyal to a system that does nothing but kill and betray us. Look at what they just did to this brother, 29-year-old Jacob Blake in Kenosha, Wisconsin. And it's going to happen again. I mean, they just grabbed this brother and shot him in the back 7 times. And then we go along, we protest, and then these I don't want to call them vultures and parasites who swoop in every time something like this happens, and then stick the family members before a camera and tell them to say that we love everybody and don't be violent. And actually try to take this question and turn it into a payday for lawyers. And that's what it is. Our struggle is bigger than that. Otherwise, we wouldn't be involved in the struggle in Kenosha. We just came out of the struggle that happened just the other day in Wisconsin. In Minneapolis, Minnesota. And before that, we were in Ferguson, Missouri. And before that, we were in New York. And before that, I mean, all over the country, you have this thing happening. It's not about that one person. It's not about getting a payday for one person. It is not about the pain of an individual. It's about the captivity and pain of an entire nation of African people who are suffering mightily. That's what it's about. And we can't concede to this assumption that somehow we cannot make this revolution because a lawyer comes in looking for a payday, or a silver-tongued, so-called civil rights opportunist comes in and teaches us a new prayer that we have to be able to put forward. And of course, in the final analysis, what they will say is vote. Vote, that's the way forward. And who do you vote for? You vote for a Republican or you vote for a Democrat. You vote for the same system. And by so doing, you end up most of the time validating the system of your oppression. This is what they've done to us. That's why we have to have a revolution. Our responsibility first and foremost, this is the responsibility that we understand in terms of tactics and strategy for revolution. Not tactics and strategy for just winning an election, but tactics and strategy for overturning a social system that is responsible for the desperate conditions of existence that we face every day and the humiliation that we face every day. How much more humiliating can it be for you to watch them grab that young brother by his shirt and shoot him 7 times in the back and then say, well, he's the cop who did it is on some kind of paid leave while they investigate. And it really doesn't matter what they do to this single cop, because it's not just this cop. This is the contest we're up against. We got to make a revolution to be free. We have to take our lives in our hands as a people. And the first task of any genuine revolutionary party, and you can't be talking about revolution if you're not talking about a party, because the Revolutionary Party is the most significant instrument that you can have that's to take power and to wield power once you take it. And if you're talking about revolution, then you have to have an instrument through which to make the revolution. And the political party is that instrument. And for African people, it's not good enough just to talk about having a political party in Kenosha, or having a political party in Ferguson, Missouri, or having a political party in the United States. We are oppressed and exploited all over the world. And as a consequence of that, foreigners and aliens are stealing all the resources that Black people, the birthright of Black people, being stolen every day. And we can't recognize it because we are looking for a Biden or for some other hustler to come along and give us an opportunity to support the very same system that is oppressing us. No, I am not saying that you must absolute terms right now not participate in an election or an electoral process. You can do that. But whatever we do in terms of electoral politics, it must be to put us on a higher level toward revolution. We must have revolution on the agenda. This is what we're fighting for, to overturn our existence as an oppressed people, to take the control of our lives for ourselves. And you need a revolutionary party. And you need a party like Garvey created. That's what we're doing in the African People's Socialist Party. You need a party that's all over the world, where every place African people exist. You need that party, because we are not going to be able to make a Florida revolution. We're not going to be able to make a so-called United States Black revolution. We're not going to be able to make a Ghana Haitian revolution. The African revolution will be made everywhere African people are located on the planet Earth. That gives us a strategic character. It also means that we recognize that Africa is the birthright of Black people all over the planet Earth, and that we're fighting for every square inch of Africa. That means we're fighting against the Americans, we're fighting against the Canadians, we're fighting against the Chinese, the Turks, the Indians, anybody that tries to control our Africa. And we're fighting against the neo-colonial puppets that have been put in power and kept in power through US drones and military force, through French murderers and military forces, through all of those forces that are used to maintain the oppression of African people. So here's what I'm saying, is that we have to go Black to the future. We have to move to the kind of resistance and struggle that has characterized our movement up until this recent period, when the white man gave us an opportunity to vote and pretend that we were voting for our freedom. We have to say, as revolutionaries, in terms of a primary strategic objective, we have to say that African people must be won to a position of independence, independence for African people, independence for Black people all around the world. That's the first thing on our agenda. Everything that we do must contribute to an understanding in the minds of African people that your future is not in the Democratic Party, the Republican Party, the Green Party, is in the future of Africa and African people ourselves. So we have to be independent. And if we mess with the Green Party, if we mess with the Democratic Party, if we mess with any of these other parties and these figures that become so significant as leftists, et cetera, we do that as a part of the project to win independence for Black people, for African people. One. Secondly, we understand that the most important social force in this revolutionary movement that we're talking about is the African working class, the most despised, the most humiliated, the most oppressed, the most murdered, the most beat up sector of the African population anywhere on the planet Earth. That's the social force that's going to make this revolution. That's the social force that has nothing to lose but our chains and oppression, our misery and our humiliation. This is what it is that we have to do. And we say that we have a political party. It's called the African People's Socialist Party. And you can find us easily. Just go to apspuhuru.org and join this campaign for actual liberation. Join this process. The only time we ever had a meaningful convention for African people was in 1920, when Marcus Garvey met and held a conference of some 25 to 50,000 Black people from all over the world. That's where you got the red, black, and green flag from. That's where you got most of the programs and progress and the strategy for the liberation that we have to win. We're gonna win it in the trenches. We're going to win it by making struggles to have our own freedom, our own independence, our own Africa, and our own resources. No matter where we are located on the planet Earth, we're going to have to fight for our total freedom, and the Democrats won't give it to us. Not the Democrats of Bernie, nor the Democrats of Biden, nor the Democratic Party of any of the others. We are going to have to take this freedom for ourselves. Uhuru, looking forward, come to the African People's Socialist Party, African APSP, uhuru.org. Uhuru.